full lineup for next semester for the spring. We've got Walt Whitman's copy of Dante. We've got Japanese forgeries, Mexican printing, Brazilian newspapers, not to mention the annual return of Peter Stalybras and Roche Chartier, like the swallows of Capistrano. So keep an eye out for that schedule coming soon. But today, I'm really pleased to welcome Heidi Brayman to the workshop. We're fortunate that her son now attends Penn, and so she finds herself on occasion in our neighborhood, and we could grab her for a presentation to us. Heidi is Associate Professor of English at the University of California, Riverside, and she's also a fixture at the Huntington Library. She's been of central importance to the history of women and women's reading in early modern England, beginning in 2005 when she published her groundbreaking first book, Reading Material in Early Modern England, Print, Gender, and Literacy. Beginning in that book by identifying all the books in the Countess of Bridgewater's library and expanding outward to study readers' marks in a huge range of books at the Huntington, which I think gave her unusual access to the stacks to do this. Heidi, in that book, Heidi reconfigured our understanding of reading in the period, displacing the imaginary reader of reader response criticism with actual readers and centering those who had often been omitted from book history: women, young people, working class people. This was a foundational study for much of the work in the history of reading that followed. As one reviewer put it, this is a book that early modern studies has needed and been struggling toward since at least the early 1980s. And at the time that the person wrote that, the early 1980s was like within living memory of academics, but now it seems like very long ago. And among other things, as I was thinking about it, I think that it was this book that first drew our attention, or at least my attention, to the now famous ownership mark, her book, or even her book, not his. It was one of the great finds. Following this was the edited collection, Reading Women, Literacy, Authorship, and Culture in the Atlantic World, 1500 to 1800, which Heidi edited with Catherine Kelly, and which was published in 2011 in the Material Text series, run by Jerry and Penn Press, and associated for a long time with this workshop. This collection, again, broke new ground in attending to women's reading. She also edited Teaching Early Modern English Literature from the Archives for the MLA Options for Teaching series. And I had the pleasure of working with her and working over about 10 years on a festra for David Caston, the book in history, the book as history, New Intersections of the Material Text. Heidi's currently writing Soundproof, Deafness and Muteness in Early Modern England, and her talk today is drawn from that new book, so please join me in welcoming her to the workshop.
I'm not going to thank you until I share my screen. Well, thank you for that wonderful, wonderful introduction, Zach. And I want to thank you for inviting me to the seminar. I want to thank John Pollock for assembling both the books I asked for and some surprises, and Lila Goldenberg for the logistics. And then I can't see, so I can't look at you right now at this moment, Peter, but I want to thank Peter Stalybras for beginning this workshop. I hadn't realized that it was an option to attend from afar, and I hope to now become a Monday regular, but it has been an iconic place for the development of book history and material text studies, and I am forever grateful for it, if only until today, by its reputation. And even though he asked me not to, I'll also thank my son for being here. I want to just start by doing a quick check of the room about people's level of familiarity with the Faerie Queene. A little rusty and some shaken heads. Okay, and I'm glad she nodded, because this also gives me a moment to do a shout out for Marissa Nicosia. And may I show the zine? So today is the day for the US release of Imagining Time in the English Chronicle play, Historical Futures, 1590 to 1660. And being rated June. So it is wonderful to both be able to celebrate very old books and absolutely hot off the press new books. Congratulations, Marissa. I can't wait to read it. So I want to just start by warning you that I'm going to talk about the Faerie Queene. And one of the reasons I chose this for my talk is that a small intervention I want to make is to really think more about the Faerie Queene and Spenser in terms of book history and print culture. And I think this workshop is representative, and perhaps I didn't do my search correctly, but I did do a search for the archives and did not find a single other talk on the Faerie Queene. And there is, and I'll talk a little bit about it in a moment, but there is a way in which I think the Faerie Queene in particular has been seen as uncomplicated in terms of its textual history, and it is routinely taught in modern editions, and even scholars who are talking about print culture cite the Thomas Roche edition and without sort of qualifying what is missing from it. So one of the things I want to do is sort of have us think some about the Faerie Queene and why it hasn't been a site as Shakespeare has been, most obviously, but also Johnson, Milton, lots of women writers, for the kind of careful bibliographical attention that we would otherwise expect. So that's one of the things I want to do. But I knew in making that choice that I would be talking to a room full of people, many of whom have not recently read the Faerie Queene. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the editions and some sort of issues with the 1590 Faerie Queene. But then I am going to do kind of some close work with one very specific canto in book one. And the quick, just get you up to speed version is that it is a very long epic romance, and this isn't even my first copy. Very long epic romance, heavily allegorical. Book one is the Book of Holiness, and it is a deeply anti-Catholic text and full of allegory. And I've put as many quotes up so that you can kind of follow along, but I apologize for sort of centering us on the Faerie Queene, but also hope that it might sort of spark your interest. Okay, so just as a starting place to kind of think about the editions, and I will say for the benefit of people on Zoom, because those of us in the room will get to look at them, I'm going to be talking about the 1590 Faerie Queene, which is the first edition. It's a quarto, and it's the first 3 books of the Faerie Queene. The 1596 edition, also quarto, is in the room, and unlike the 1590, and it includes all 6 books of the Faerie Queene. And then we also have we have the 1609 and the 1611 and the 1679.
We have the 96, 1596, 1611, 11, 15, kind of weird.
Okay.
And a later one,
1679. Yeah. So those will be a great treat to look at. So before I launch into kind of the reading itself, I want to just say a few things about really the failure of the Faerie Queene to attract the kind of close, sustained attention that some contemporary works have. The 1590 Faerie Queene in particular has not attracted the attention to its printing comparable to its status as what Adam Zerker, its one great sort of modern scholar, calls the largest work of English poetry ever seen through the press by a living author in 1590. The still authoritative study is now 90 years old. This is its 90th anniversary year, F.R. Johnson's Critical Bibliography of Editions to 1700. And I wanted to sort of just signal a couple of the issues that tend to come up with the 1590 Faerie Queene. There is a long-held belief, started by F.R. Johnson and then perpetuated by others, that Spenser was intimately involved in the print shop, that he was at John Wool's print shop, overseeing lots of details. In a recent study, I think it's 2017, Hazel Wilkinson has a new book which really takes up F.R. Johnson's study, which goes to 1700, and is a study of the 18th century editions of the Faerie Queene. And in that, she argues that Spenser's publication history, I'm quoting here, has not been neglected by oversight or chance, but in part because of a series of myths about the condition in which his poems were published. And she discredits the notion that Spenser supervised the printing of the Faerie Queene, saying that that narrative begins in the 18th century. And the other great scholar of modern scholar who I've just mentioned, Andrew Zurcher, has done an extensive study of the printing of the 1590 Faerie Queene. And he says that the story of its printing is likely more complicated and more revealing than bibliographers have to date led us to believe. So in thinking about the 1590 quarto Faerie Queene, it has gathered attention 90 years ago from F.R. Johnson, and then Andrew Zurcher has produced a wonderful, very, very long article about its printing and its history. But otherwise, the attention really has focused on the paratexts, on the dedicatory and commendatory letters and poems, which oddly come at the very end of the quarto. And what I want to do today is to look instead closely at a head note and also draw our attention to some variant spellings. And at issue, of course, is this question about how accidental these moments that I'm going to draw our attention to, how accidental those are, how much they are accidental collaborations with the printers, and how much they were a result of Spenser's oversight. And to me, in some ways, it doesn't really matter, but I do want to draw our attention to those, particularly to the head notes. So in addition to thinking more about book history, print culture with the Faerie Queene, I also want to think about critical disability studies alongside book history. And as critical disability studies have burgeoned, it is one of the subfields in our discipline that hasn't so much really connected, at least in early modern studies, with book history and print culture. And then the last thing I want to say, just sort of by way of introduction, is that as part of thinking about critical disability studies and print culture and book history, I'm interested in thinking about how descriptions of books include language of the body, and particularly what could be seen as a disabled body. And just to kind of get us started and to get some wonderful copy-specific notes up here from the beginning, I have a couple examples from the Spenser Archive Finding Aid, which is part of the Spenser Online project. And I will do a shout out at this moment to my wonderful undergraduate teacher who introduced me to Spenser, Joe Lowenstein, who's one of the people behind this. And so, you know, if you look at this sort of reference to the body of the book, the spine being cracked, the looseness, the only fairness, and then this one, which I find even more useful, you know, bound in contemporary blind stamped calf, which I'll say something about, the ornament in blind on the sides, the back slightly defective. So I'm going to be focusing on Canto 3 in Book 1 of the Faerie Queene. Each canto of the Faerie Queene has a head note, which gives a quite partial and often heavily allegorized summary of what is to come. And so this is it for Canto 3. Appearing in a single episode in Edmund Spenser's 1590 Faerie Queene, Abessa has been identified by disability scholars as the one significant exception in early modern representations of deafness. Perhaps in Jennifer Nelson and Bradley Barron's accounting, the only physically deaf character in English literature prior to 1720. Whereas deafness is usually figured as voluntary in the period, its privileges appropriated by hearing characters, Spenser's Abessa is actually not voluntarily deaf. Strikingly, neither the word deaf nor mute is used to characterize her. Instead, we learn that she could not hear, nor speak, nor understand. A succinct rollout of the early modern assumptions about deafness. Though it is an ancient Old English word, the word deaf never appears in the Faerie Queene. Similarly, Abessa herself does not appear explicitly in the 4-line selective summary of the action of Canto 3. Forsaken truth long seeks her love and makes the lion mild, mars blind devotion's mart, and falls in hand of lecher viled. Those of you who know this canto will recognize forsaken truth as Una, blind devotion as Corcheca, and the lecher viled as Sansloy. Abessa's mononymic absence from the headnote is not unusual. Minor characters routinely miss the spotlight of the canto summaries. What is extraordinary is a typographical curiosity that is invisible in modern editions, the form in which most of us encounter, study, and teach the poem. Unique in the 1590 Faerie Queene, the air is not repeated in any of the other headnotes, and there are 35 other headnotes in the 1590 quarto. It is present in all the copies that I have examined to date, of which 64 are extant, and then it is corrected in the 1596 edition. What interests me and stands as a visual conceit for my concerns today is the way in which the initial letters of the 2 longer tetrameter lines have been offset. I suspect that those 2 longer lines were not secured tightly enough in the compositor's chase with furniture or wooden blocks. Then when the pressman pulled the bar on the hand press, the considerable force met insufficient resistance, and the most vulnerable pieces of type were those letters dangling over what on the resulting page looks like empty space. In the printing process, that blank space, as all of you know, is created not by emptiness, of course, but by the compositor placing shorter pieces of metal first into a composing stick and then into the chase or the frame for the type. And just because I finally got to go to the Plantin Museum, I thought I would send a picture. I want to think about those shorter flat pieces of metal and sometimes wood as mute. Without a letter or mark of punctuation elevated to make an inked impression onto paper, these pieces of type speak only in blanks, in potential. The language of disability, like that of gender, race, and national identity, is attached to aspects of book production. And I'm thinking here of work like Miles Greer's upcoming Ink Phase, Brandy Adams' work in terms of race, national identity, think of English Black Letter, gender. Lots and lots of us have written about impressions and reproduction. Douglas Brooks has written about paternity and reproduction. Since the 19th century, an uninked indentation on a page can be called a blind impression, and ornamental markings on leather bindings that do not include a layer of gilt have been known as blind stamped bindings. But if we think of the pieces of metal and wood that created blank spaces in the hand press era as mutes, we can begin to capture the sense of real lexical possibility available in moments of vocal silence. The printer's air in this canto summary is wonderfully appropriate to Canto 3. And we'll look at it again. So blind stamp binding, and then back to this. At the most local level, 4 has literally begun to forsake its second half, and mar is marred. On a more extended level, as I will be suggesting, the 1590 printers brilliantly, if fully accidentally, capture the poem's relationship to Catholic deafness and muteness. Through Abessa, the Faerie Queene erases, misrepresents, and casts as illegible a richly generative lexical alterability that was coming into view in more sustained ways in 16th century England. Deafness and its corollary muteness are neither explicitly named nor readily understood in the Abessa episode. Do you know if there's a way to make it so it's the whole thing is visible? Yeah, nice to see the whole thing. Canto 3 opens with Una traveling alone with her palfrey until she is joined by a sympathetic lion. Desolate, as in exile, Una at last found the trodden grass in which the tract of people's footing was. This detail highlights Una's visual acuity and alertness to her surroundings as she recognizes human tracks imprinted in mere grass. Following these tracks, she at last spies Abessa, first taking her to distance as a damsel. Abessa's failure to respond to Una's voice, however, immediately moves her to another category, that of a rude wench. It is the first appearance of the adjective rude in the poem, though not of the adverb rudely. Though rude could mean impolite by this period, a constellation of other earlier meanings dominates the word's circulation. Most of these medieval and still current meanings in 1590 framed rudeness as various deficiencies of reason, wit, kindness, experience, social standing. 2 of these deficiencies pertain directly to Abessa's status as a non-hearing, non-speaking person. The OED includes in its long list of meanings available in the 16th century for the word rude, 2 that are distinctly acoustic and linguistic. 1, unpleasant to hear, discordant, and 2, lacking elegance of language. So powerful is the negative association with deafness here that Abessa's perceived status as a damsel is demoted to that of a rude wench, even before she fails to respond. As Una's assessment of Abessa shifts from the visual to the oral, from high to low, the stanza pivots on the narrator's explanation that Abessa could not hear, nor speak, nor understand. With the next line's return to sight, till seen, the perspective is Abessa's for the first time. Frightened as much, it seems, by the novelty of Una's beauty as by the lion's gaze, Abessa throws down her water pitcher and runs home, where she conveys her fear, but no other import to her blind mother. Full fast she fled, ne never looked behind, as if her life upon the wager lay, and home she came, whereas her mother blind sat in eternal night. Naught could she say, but sudden catching hold did her dismay with quaking hands and other signs of fear, who full of ghastly fright and cold affray, gan shut the door. Abessa's communication with her mother is purely physiological, not linguistic. Her signs of fear, that is, are not the semiotics of manual gesture, but rather the embodied expression of adrenaline. Her quaking hands communicate no subtler meaning than terror. Neither Una nor Queene, who's another allegorical figure who comes and visits the cottage, Queene comes later that evening and knocks fast and often cursed and swear for entrance. Neither he nor Una seem to understand or metabolize Abessa's deafness. These allegorical characters don't incorporate Abessa's deafness, nor does Abessa survive the episode because she is such a literary outlier. Modes of engagement with the deaf, still scarcely available in the culture at large, simply haven't been invented in the literature of the period. Abessa's episode, therefore, provides a moment where sensory impairment is both allegorized and marked in traces that are fragmentary and inconsistent. In a poem famously animated by metamorphosing characters and attention to body parts, this episode stands out as remarkably incoherent in terms of the figuration of its characters' bodies. Abessa all but vanishes unremarked. Korcheka's blindness becomes merely allegorical. The lion attacks with his hand, and Kirkrapin's body is dismembered and then reconstituted without explanation or acknowledgement. The poem, I would argue, hasn't figured out how to maintain its attention to disabled or non-normative bodies. To track and understand this rupture, I want to turn to a constellation of moments in Book One that are verbally and thematically connected to this episode. Upon finding Kirkrapin, whom the lion has rent into 1,000 pieces, Abessa and Korcheka, and here's the stanza where this happens, for anguish great they gan to rend their hair and beat their breasts and naked flesh to tear. While context and convention make clear that hair here is a variant spelling for hair, it is a rare and striking variant in Book One. The framing rhyme, deer, rhyming with here but not hair, plants the possibility even more strongly that Abessa and Korcheka are rending their hearing. This variant spelling, I would argue, is yet another way in which the episode calls attention to hearing, noise, and speech, even as Abessa, the poem's one non-hearing character, is excluded from those categories. Abessa's deafness and her erasure figure in the final scene in the episode. Having discovered Kirkrapin's dismembered corpse, Abessa and Korcheka pursue Una with revenging will. Curiously, for all their self-rending violence, which mimics the lion's dismemberment of Kirkrapin, their vengeance takes the form of noise, then speech, rather than any physical assault. And I want to just draw your attention. I encourage you to notice the pronouns that I've italicized and also that word, bray, which I like, that is part of my name. While the plural they, who bray, might read as a lapse during which Spencer seems to have forgotten that Abessa cannot speak, as other scholars have suggested, Spencer's lapse goes further. Within the limited early modern understanding of deafness, Abessa is fully capable of braying, howling, and crying. Braying in particular is associated with non-human sound. And Carla Mazzio has written wonderfully about sort of non-human sounds in her wonderful monograph. Made monstrous by both their sensory impairments and their allegorical roles as representatives of Catholicism, Abessa and Korcheka are rendered non-human by the sounds they make. With a crucial exception, to which I will turn shortly, braying in the Faerie Queene is the acoustic terrain of non-human characters. In Book One, Error, Orgoglio, and the dragon bray. Later in the poem, bray is the province exclusively of deer, trumpets, tigers, giants, and monsters. Howl is similarly otherwise assigned to wolves and ghosts. Once the noise shifts to intelligible railing, however, the pronouns shift from they to she. Abessa disappears from the canto, that is, at the moment that her mother's speech becomes necessary to the narrative. Without other explanation, Abessa simply vanishes, and the pair becomes one. Her mother accuses Una of harlotry and curses her. The repetition of the word railing in this stanza, shifting from participle to noun, retroactively claims it as an utterance of Korcheka's alone. And still amidst her railing, she did pray. The next two stanzas, in which Korcheka meets Archimago and directs him towards Una, insistently drop Abessa from the narrative by assigning all action, speech, and perspective to Korcheka. And again, you can kind of track the pronouns there. Korcheka continues what had been the mother-daughter joint action of railing and here rending, but now she acts alone. Far from forgetting that Abessa cannot talk, Spencer drops her altogether as the narrative emphasis turns to report. Only Korcheka, in the oddest world of early modern England, can bring tidings, could tell in, and so forth told the story that directs Archimago to Una. If Spencer forgets one of the pair's impairments, it would seem to be Korcheka's blindness. Not only is her resignation framed with the idiom she saw, but the careful attention to Archimago's disguise as Red Cross is not qualified for Korcheka, on whom his mighty arms embossed would have been lost. Abessa, unable to hear or speak, has no place in the narrative, even as an allegorical figure, and certainly not as a singular example of a deaf character. Abessa, cut off from speech and understanding by her deafness in the world of the poem, disappears once she can no longer perform a narrative function. Scholars of the poem have similarly erased Abessa, leaning into her associations with Abessa and collapsing her with her mother, emphasizing only the blind-heartedness of the episode, very much following the headnote. Abessa's deafness and muteness, however, continue to resonate rhizomatically in the middle cantos of Book 1 through the character of Una. Una speaks first, the first lines in the poem, Be Well Aware, and she dominates the first episode in Canto 1, speaking 24 lines to Red Cross, who is the title character. Red Cross is 3 lines, and the dwarf's single line. On the other side of the Abessa episode, however, with her lion protector slain and plucked from her horse by Sans Loy and flung across his courser, Una laments her plight. And the point I want to especially draw your attention to is that with her piteous plaints, she filleth his dull ears, and that he nothing hears. Sans Loy appears constitutionally incapable of hearing Una. Her words fill his ears, but their dullness and his rancor deafen him. While Abessa is both deaf and mute, that muteness is still allowing for some non-human sounds, non-verbal sounds. As Una moves forward in these middle episodes, other characters' dullness of hearing has the effect of muting her. This scene, it is worth noting, foregrounds a sexual assault. Fearing assault, Una penetrates Sans Loy autologically, but he seems not to notice. Though she does not vanish entirely like Abessa, Una nevertheless drops out of the narrative for 2 cantos. Abducted and suspended on the verge of sexual assault for 2 cantos until the narrator resumes her story in Canto 6. Alone in the forest with the lecherous Sans Loy, Una virtually performs the impairments of Abessa and Korcheka. Deaf and blind to Sans Loy's words and looks, Una is like a rock of diamonds, steadfast evermore. Her temporary deafness and blindness, unlike the impairments of Abessa and Korcheka in Canto 3, are protective virtues. But once Sans Loy turns to physical force, Una does throw out thrilling shrieks and shrieking cries, the last vain help of women's great distress. The urgent question is whether anyone will hear. The scene has already recalled Canto 3 through a series of verbal echoes. And we can talk about this later, but there's a series of them. But it is the word bray that most draws my attention once Una redoubles her vocal efforts. As Abessa and Corcheca bray at Una rather than physically attacking her, so Una makes noise rather than physically fighting Sans Loy. As her excessive tears redounded and softly echoed in Canto 3, so now her shrieks resound and rebounded across great acoustic distances. The acoustic force of Una's cries and her desperation are held too in the word bray, nowhere else in the poem characterizing a positive human character, and never after Una a female one. Una's brain is arresting and unsettling, perhaps most of all for its suggestion that the frantic cries of a woman in the midst of a sexual assault are unseemly, even beastly, and monstrous. Her brain, in the context of the poem, also suggests how very nearly this near rape, in Judith Anderson's phrase, becomes a rape. Characters in the Faerie Queene bray in moments of mortal peril. Orgoglio, the dragon, both bray. And even in the headnote for Canto 6, even though we are assured there that from lawless lust by wondrous grace, fair Una is released, an alternative is imagined in Sans Loy's belief that the fort he weaned possessed soon to be. Una's brain is a moment too that shows the long reach of sound in the book. While Abessa and Corcheca's brain seem to have little effect on Una in Canto 3, their brain now resurfaces in Una's own voice. Unlike theirs, Una's brain creates a sympathetic vibration, a non-human sound reaching non-human ears and summoning to her aid a rude, misshapen, monstrous rabblement in the form of the wild wood gods. Una has a complicated acoustic life. She moves across registers from high-minded directive to wailing to brain, and her vocalizing sometimes falls on dull ears and elsewhere summons the aid of a savage nation. But what can she hear? Twice in Book 1, Una demonstrates her extraordinary preternatural ability to hear Red Cross across distance and time. This heightened sense of hearing is yet another way that Una transfigures Abessa's deafness and muteness, even as she absorbs it. Further, it is not just Una who absorbs Abessa's qualities, but also Gloriana, or the Faerie Queene herself, one of two explicit stand-ins for Queen Elizabeth in the poem. In Canto 9, Prince Arthur recounts the dream that has propelled him forward for 9 months in search of the royal maid who laid beside him in a dream. And you can see his recollection that only pressed grass survives, recalling that moment where Una sees the imprint of Abessa's feet in the grass. One of the reasons Abessa vanishes from the narrative of Book 1 of the Faerie Queene is that she, unlike her namesake Abesses, has no access to communicative sign. And in a longer version of this, what the rest of this chapter does is puts it in conversation with the abbesses after the Reformation who sought refuge in different country houses and also on the continent, and their use of manual gesture. A daughter rather than a mother, she merely quakes with fear, communicating only that heightened affective state to Corcheca. Abessa, through isolation and the impairment of her mother, has no way to communicate beyond brain. Her signs don't bear language in this poem. Of the many polemical caricatures of nuns and monks in Canto 3 of Spenser's Book of Holiness, Abessa's inability to sign meaningfully may well have been the least intelligible to contemporary readers. contemporary readers were used to whoring nuns, as we see, but a silent nun, an abbess unable to communicate, I would argue, would read unintelligibly to early moderns who had glimpsed post-Reformation recusant nuns. I want to end just with a tiny coda and a reminder of the ways in which we have become so used to using modern editions, even scholars of the poem. And this is another moment of silence. I'm really interested in silence typographically and thematically. On the left is the Thomas Roche edition, A.C. Hamilton, it appears the same. And on the right is, and I apologize for using Ebo, but on the right is the Folger copy from Ebo, where you can see that the Welsh words have been removed. And this is from, I would say quite appropriately, a wonderful canto that takes place in a library. And the entire canto 10 is the reading of these chronicles. And the Welsh has been omitted here. And I want to sort of close with this and invite our conversation moving forward to pose the larger question of how silence and muteness get represented typographically, and what a moment like this, which we might just say is an accidental sort of printing mistake, but what it means for us to teach, write about, read a poem like the Faerie Queene on the left, when its contemporary first readers would have encountered instead this far, far stranger stanza in Canto 10. So what do I do now? Now I stop sharing?
And, great.
Okay.
So the floor is open, and as I forgot to remind everyone on Zoom, feel free to use that raise hand function to let us know you have a question, or you can write it in the chat, and we'll try to call on you as well. Lilia.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I'm working primarily on German things, and a little bit later. So if in the early 15th century a person feels new, this person is usually possessed. Possessed. And there is something going on which is not the usual. Now, I wonder about something else. If one talks about disability, one takes it for granted that there is a healthy human body and something is not right or not functioning, feeling the loss of hearing or being it is very human-centered. You would not call a cat disabled because the cat doesn't talk. Now, it seems to me that this poem is extremely fluid in terms of humanity. That the fluidity goes between the human and the spirit and the animal. Rather dramatically for the back. So is it then correct, and I know I'm provoking you now, is it then correct to talk about disability? Or isn't it that one moves into another sphere where one can experience without talking, or hearing without hearing, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, thank you very much. And when you're thinking about the possessions, are those English examples, or do you work in another? German, okay.
They are possessed. It's all that the devil is in the person, and that's why talk or whatever, very often women. That's very different. So that is obviously not touched in the argument.
Right.
But the question of being centered on a healthy human being in this poem seems to me a little bit odd on first sight.
A little bit
odd at first sight.
odd at first sight. Yes, and I think you use the word fluidity, and that's a wonderful way to describe the poem. And one of the things that's interested me is I've kind of been tracking the kind of mute moments in the canto, and I use that word rhizomatically, and sort of seeing where muteness and deafness go in the poem. There's so much kind of code switching in terms of how muteness and deafness are figured. I mean, but in terms of what you were saying about kind of the emphasis on the human, I would say that the Faerie Queene even goes farther. It's not just human and animal, but also vegetal. There are trees that talk and hear.
But can you then talk about disability? That's my question.
Yeah.
Because you're not saying the line is disabled because it doesn't speak language or something. You know, it's a question of when do you start the conversation about disability?
Mm-hmm. And when you say when, do you mean chronologically, historically, or in the poem?
If you do, you have to presuppose a human body,
Mm-hmm.
and individual-centered narrative, some idea of what is forward and healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't strike me in this poem to apply at all.
No, I think that's one of the things that really draws me to thinking about these issues, which elsewhere in the book I work on drama, dumb shows, mutes on stage. But I got really interested in thinking about it in the Faerie Queene because it does seem such an outlier. And I would say that the Faerie Queene, I mean, in the period, speaking and hearing are so constitutive of humanness. And it's a moment in England and in Europe, though I've not worked on the German examples, I worked on French and Spanish examples. It's a moment where it seems to first occur to people, to the culture at large, that someone who is deaf might actually have a soul, might be capable of reason, salvation. So there's a very strong bias in the period that equates speech with humanity. And terms like, thinking about animals that you mentioned, animals are often called dumb beasts. So the sort of absence of speech. So it's absolutely human-centric. So I'll thank you for kind of pushing in that direction. One of the things I really like about the Faerie Queene is that it's not tidy. And I think even though we're not in sort of total agreement here, and I don't have a fuller answer for you, I do think the poem is pressing against like what it means to be human, how speech figures, and that deafness and muteness and an imprint in the grass could first be aligned with this very anti-Catholic caricature of an abbess, and then shift to kind of truth, Protestant truth itself in the figure of Una, and then to the Faerie Queene herself with that imprint on the grass.
Oh, Thomas. Yeah, Thomas, do you want to? I hesitate to say unmute yourself.
Thank you, Heidi. That was such an interesting talk, and I was especially interested in where you ended with these elisions or leaving out the the Welsh words, which I didn't know about. I mean, that's so fascinating. And I've written about the ways in which Irish sound is sort of represented as a kind of non-human or subhuman or throughout the Faerie Queene. And I mean, I hadn't thought to sort of connect that to disability and as sort of language impairment as such. And so I guess the first thing, the main question I sort of wanted to ask was about whether just to ask you to say a bit more about the whether, I mean, you've drawn attention to how Welsh is working in this kind of blind, mute, deaf sort of way, perhaps in, typographically on the page, but also whether among the sounds being conjured with abessa, might be the, sort of ubiquitous sounds of Irishness that we sort of find throughout the poem. And I guess that the second thing, I mean, I was just kind of playing with that moment in what you call it, the little 4-line,
Head note?
but yeah, head note, that's it. And just sort of thinking about how both in what it says and in the error that seems to have crept in, all kinds of interesting sort of linguistic possibilities present themselves. And I couldn't help but see the way that MA had kind of fallen in line with the IN of the next line, which is then followed by hand. So you have the French, main, and hand, and then you have just even the word as it appears, falls, FALS, which I think sort of invite a kind of misreading as false, in relation to true devotion at the top. And so the way that the text is sort of inviting these misreadings, either deliberately or accidentally. So I guess those are sort of two things to play with. I don't know if there's a question there, but just would love to hear what you have to say about any of that.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Thank you. And most of all, thank you for continuing to play with that like weird typographical error, because I love it for all the reasons you've just said. And I've wondered if I have just gotten too taken with it, and that the fact that you sort of see these other possibilities that I didn't mention is lovely. Thank you. I mentioned Hazel Wilkinson's book on sort of the 18th century Spenser. And one of the things that she talks about in that book early on is she talks about the way in which scholars have insufficiently attended to the unreadability of the Faerie Queene. And in some ways, she's talking about the notion that it's just impenetrable. She has this quotation about how 1 in 10 people who read Canto 1 finish book 1, and 1 in 100 make it to the Blatant Beast. And but it also, I think, ties into this idea of the misreadings that you're playing with, and just the way in which that head note invites, like it foregrounds the confusion of reading and the multiplicity of readings. And I love that idea of kind of the accidental collaboration and the accidents that can happen in a print shop that actually produce so much meaning and open a lot up. In terms of the Irish bit, I love that connection. I mean, I think it's so weird that it's the Welsh that's missing, because it's not like there's some letter that they had to wait for. I mean, it would come from the same case. So it's a really strange omission. And one of the things I would love to put it in conversation with, just as a separate thing, would be the kind of absent Welsh in Henry V. I mean, I just think that would be really interesting to put into conversation together. So one of the things that scholars have said about the Welsh in the Faerie Queene without attending to this gap is that the Welsh references play up the notion of Queen Elizabeth's Welsh roots. And so I also really like the idea that what's missing is kind of a language that was not intelligible, legible to all, a language that, like Irish, would have been seen as other, not reproducible as part of the stanza, but it's also this connection, this sort of suggested connection to Queen Elizabeth, especially if we think about Arthur's dream with the Faerie Queene, kind of Elizabeth just leaving this infant on the grass. So it's a lot to play with. And I would love to sort of talk Irish and Welsh with you.
say that we have a representation of approach.
Yeah.
And also how language at the same time was seen as credit, this connection between language as an expression of identity.
Mhm.
In regards to the thing that at the same time, maybe before the concept of strength in the church was pushing forward the expansion of civilization to the local languages. So for me, just making this connection of language in this moment, it is not only an intellectual feature, but also a feature that is going to receive salvation. So language is true salvation.
Mhm.
And it's going sometimes happening in Africa, it's going to have first grammars in America. And I would like to know if maybe the Anglican context or the context of the great people, you're going to find something related with language and salvation in more theological.
Yeah. I mean, one way I would go after that would be what I alluded to earlier, that one of the real pressures on developing a language or a way of communicating for the deaf was to achieve salvation. And so in the period, there's, in terms of the different senses, it's in England, it's not just, and elsewhere in Europe, it's not just the 5 senses that we kind of think of as so standard. Other senses sometimes count, things like proprioception, and the hierarchy, sort of sight and hearing tend to be at the top in most theological accounts, but hearing often is privileged over sight. And because of the notion that one needs to be able to hear sermons, to hear the word of God, and that really hearing is a primary path to salvation. And so some of the kind of early pressures towards language acquisition for the deaf had to do with that. Like, you need to be able to hear, you need to be able to speak, communicate in some way in order to be saved. So I think it's absolutely in there. The other related piece I would mention is that manual systems of communication, starting in the 17th century, are often associated with fantasies of a universal language. And even now, when I talk to acquaintances or say what I'm working on and say I'm interested in sign language, contemporaries, modern people often say, like, oh gosh, so like, does one system work like for all languages? So there's even now there's this residual sense of a manual sign system as somehow being more elemental, more primary, more nearly universal. And so that was also part. So what you're talking about in sort of other nations, other parts of the world, there's a real point of contact with this, again, fantasy. Like even British Sign Language and American Sign Language, modern, it's like, I can almost understand most French Sign Language. I'm completely lost with British Sign Language because it's so fundamentally different from ASL.
Peter, Annie.
Thanks so much for a wonderful talk, Heidi. It was fabulous. I wanted to go back to Thomas's question and the whole thing, because what's the beginning of your talk? What's actually happening there is leading. In other words, that for the words to be, so it's not blank space. In other words, what appears as blank space, the compositors are actually putting in lead.
Right.
And so we presume they're pushing in lead. And what's interesting about it to me is it's not just the Welsh that goes missing. Lots of the English goes missing.
Yeah.
So the English words at the end. So what I presume they're doing is they're putting in leading temporarily, expecting to come back and to have worked out what the hell's going on. So in other words, so all the sign of sad cruelty is also missing.
Yeah.
So that's all there in later editions, but all of this is missing. So this is just a sort of wild thought. There's a wonderful work by Pete Van Boxel on censorship of Hebrew manuscripts, where they actually censors took out things and put in blank space, which makes nonsense. In other words, literally, so the Hebrew doesn't make sense anymore. So it's to get out what we consider blasphemous statements. And so one of the things, one of the paradoxes of this that Pete was talking about is how it massively draws attention to it. It always does. And so, of course, what's massively being drawn attention to here is this missing text. You know, you haven't seen anything like it in the rest of the Faerie Queene. You've suddenly come across this blank text. But it's the compositors, going back to this, they actually have put something in there. But what they've put in is something that is, and I put it very much in quotation marks, a blind impression. It's a blind impression that's there. So you can't see it, but there is something there. But what's there is simply spacing material to hold the rest of the type in place. So you always need to put, so if you don't put so there is something there. And it interests me so much about this is it's something there that absolutely parades itself as unreadable. So you're back to where you began in a way. At the very beginning, you were talking about there, the actual blank, the blank space is slipping. It's not intentional. This is absolutely intentional. It's intentional by the compositors because they can't make sense of it. And so it's absolutely intentional blank space meant to be filled in eventually. And then remarkably, they didn't get any feedback. I don't know what happened. I mean, so they print the book with this temporary spacing material. So that's my question is what do you think was going on? I mean, with in the printing house that could possibly have let it go to press like this?
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Peter. That's because you're exactly, I mean, I wanted to end the talk with it because I see the same kind of thing happening, but you're right. It's the leading on the compositor's stick is quite different from that sort of slippage that happens in the head note. I mean, I think it, and thank you also for calling attention to the fact that it's not just the Welsh that drops out, but also, you know, rather sign of sad cruelty. And I mean, another weird thing that happens across, that just gets cleaned up is he becomes it, which is also a strange little, you know, again, and never noted. Not, you know, none of the sort of usual suspect modern editions make any mention of this. So I think it's what I haven't seen and what I would love to come upon, and I invite everyone here, if you in your travels have a Faerie Queene at a library, look and see if this has been filled in any copy.
University of Illinois on Happy Trust. I needed to see this for myself.
Because that has really amazing marginalia in it.
Pen facsimile, but not it's translated. The text filled in is that not the same man, 3 dashes. And then I can't see, he must, okay, then it's printed, he must seem to be, but next line, rather a goat his face, and handles all bloody be. That is, I'm looking at it.
And so that, because that, I haven't examined that copy in person, but I've looked at the digitized, and you must have. I mean, Illinois, Champaign,
I think that's where it is.
But they've written in the wrong.
They're written a text, but it's a wrong text.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
That's thanks to the internet.
Yeah, because that copy has.
Sorry, I can't share about the book.
Yeah.
Sorry, Zoomers, but
Is that a translation of the Welsh?
Thomas
Looking at me.
requested you repeat that. Oh, and then Jim also requested you repeat it.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so here is.
Just confirm.
So this is the copy at University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana.
Yes.
And I have it just
available on Happy Trust.
Right.
Read all.
And so I have, because I thought if we wanted to look at any marginalia, I'd have it deep in the PowerPoint just in case. And so I love that, you know, England is stored with bridges, hills, and woods, with churches, Wells and Women Beautiful. Again, and then we get the 1645 ownership mark. And then this I also like, be it known unto all men by these presents. So this copy has really interesting marginalia, but what John did on the fly, which is the wonderful thing about having laptops and resourceful people in the room, is he went to look at the same one on Happy Trust to see how it dealt with, back there, how it dealt with this bit. And someone has written in careful kind of mimicking print, careful script, but has put, I don't know if I say wrong, but has not put the text of the 15 that shows up in 1596. So what would be wonderful to know, like, is it possible that that was written by someone who hadn't seen the 1596 or the later editions? Because it looks wrong to us because we know how it ended up and we know by 1596 and how it shows up in modern editions. But someone just with the 1590 copy in their home, not collating it, filled it in.
It seems like what's happened there is they're waiting for someone who knows Welsh. The compositor is waiting for someone who knows Welsh to decipher the manuscript.
Yeah.
Right? And I almost even wonder if the he, the Welsh ends in an H,
yes,
and then H followed by it maybe looks like he.
Yeah.
And so the compositor doesn't know when the Welsh ends and the English starts up.
Right.
And then they forget to, it just seems like they forget to go back and fill it in, which is a very bad mistake.
It's a very bad mistake.
It's not any worse. It's also a very bad mistake to leave that fallen type.
Right.
And if you've never seen a copy with the,
Never.
and presumably there was a copy without it, but it may have happened very early in the run.
Right.
That's a very bad thing to not notice too. So it does challenge the idea that Spencer's very intimately involved in the printing, for one thing. The bit with the Welsh is reminiscent of the Shakespeare. I can never remember which sonnet it is, but one of the sonnets has only 12 lines.
Yes.
And then there are the parentheses, surrounding the maybe missing lines, and people debate whether the lines are missing or not. Which number is it? 116. And so that's another way of representing absence or muteness of some kind there. And people have, tried to fill those in or imagined what's missing or was it intended to be missing. You don't have another edition to collate against it as you have here. But I wonder about other instances that you could find of kind of representing the missing text in type. And I've seen just empty space where something is left out, not censored like Peter's talking about, but text that's not present, that's not available.
Can you add what Thomas has put in the chat? So Thomas, can you speak to what you put in the chat, Thomas?
Yes. Sorry. I was just noting that there's a similar phenomenon in Sydney's Arcadia. There are a number of places, and I can go and find them if it's helpful, where spaces were deliberately left in the text, not as a mistake. Then they were absolutely meant to signal the fact that Sydney hadn't finished the Arcadia, and of course the most dramatic example is in the 1590 edition. It stops mid-sentence, and actually even the headnote has a blank space, that's this headnote to that chapter. But there are also individual copies where readers have gone in and written in things in those blank spaces. So I don't have those at my fingertips, but I could certainly find them. But it's sort of interesting. Again, it's like these sort of mute signifiers in the text, and of course, so
no, thank you for making that connection. Actually, the case study I did for the Long Ago book that Zach mentioned was of Sydney's Arcadia. And so I looked at 150 copies of them, and there, that last single word, and that ends it, capital A and. I mean, it's been a long time now. I don't remember ever seeing anyone complete that, but certainly the kind of ornaments that you're, where, later a poem might be written, a fair number of those get filled in. So it's, one of the things, I haven't done that level of survey with the Faerie Queene, but anecdotally, my sense is that the Faerie Queene just doesn't get annotated. And maybe no one here would be surprised. Maybe people just aren't finishing it, but it doesn't get annotated the way, even the Arcadia does. I want to go back for a moment to this issue of leading and, Zach's idea that, the compositor just doesn't kind of know where the Welsh ends and the English begins. Because it is really curious that rather gets cut off, sign of sad cruelty. I mean, because you would think there would be clues like in the rhyme, the bee and cruelty, that would tip a compositor off. But that idea of the leading, that Peter was mentioning, that the leading sort of taking up all that space. And Peter, let me ask you, like, for that line that's just but, I mean, I've learned how to use a hand press and compose type, but it's been a while, so I've forgotten, with that, would that whole line be leaded?
Yes.
And I wonder, I also wonder
the whole line
if
would be, the whole
the
line.
whole line would need to be, yeah.
Something there.
But
I mean,
think
something,
that
but I mean, I wonder how far it would go.
it would go to the measure.
To the
end
measure,
of the
yeah.
compositor's stick.
Yeah.
I think the compositor in the first line, that is the second to last line,
Right,
is trying very hard to leave out just the Welsh.
right.
And then in the last line is like, I'm coming back to this later.
Yeah.
And it's just marking, it's just putting but to signal what
There's a
line
line.
it is in the manuscript.
Yeah.
So you have the first word and
Yeah.
then just leaving the rest out.
Yeah.
Can I just say, I mean, the one thing that makes it all the odder is that in this very period, as Randy McLeod has shown, sometimes people, for pure visual effects, the compositors are actually adding material. This is it in the Holinshed, for instance. So that in a Holinshed, at a certain point, about halfway through, I forget which edition it is. Anyway, it's all in Randy's edition of it. To the facsimile edition, he shows that that before a prose for a poetic passage, they tried to fill out the previous prose line to the end of the line to make it look good. So you've actually got invention by the printer, the compositor, which isn't there in any of the actual the text that they're copying. They're copying their known text, their other chronicles, but they're doing it purely for visual effect. They're actually, so what really, this makes it much more striking that this is an incredible goof, to put it mildly. I mean, that when you've got a poem as carefully composed as Spenser's is, where the stanza form, each stanza has, and the head notes, everything about it. You've got all the lace, the printer's lace around the head notes. So there's a level of care on the one hand, and then to say to hell with it, we're going to go back to this passage and fix it, and then to forget about fixing it and just print it anyway, does seem to me remarkable.
And especially where it is on the page. Like, it's at the top of the page.
Yeah.
It would be very easy. It's not sort of buried or tucked away or down near a catchword, because it's interesting. Like, if it's at the bottom of the page, you might also almost think that was a catchword sort of in the wrong spot, but it's so obvious. So, yeah.
Thanks. So much fun. Can I maybe take advantage of the fact that it's maybe Anzac at the front of the room and just throw something out, because, okay, so I'm kind of on the side of the impossibility of reading the Faerie Queene and just a dense difficulty. And I was just, so here's a ridiculous, crazy question. I mean, to read the Faerie Queene is an exercise in reading allegorically. And you're having us look at typography, and of course, Zach is an expert on certain kinds of ways that English readers responded to typography. So how do you think in 1590 readers read typographically? If you can understand my question, you can do anything you want, but you know, what are the kinds of reading of error or typographical significance that are culturally available, do you think? Because it seems to me that you're trying to, in order to help you answer your questions about what type and its relationship to meaning is, we have to have a sense of what people could understand these things to mean. I mean, I could may throw my own guesses out, but I'm curious what you guys think, if that makes any sense.
Actually, the Faerie Queene had us off. I guess I should start. This isn't quite typography, but it's also very specific to the 1590 Faerie Queene that speaks to reading. So the Letter to Raleigh, which is the sort of explanation of how to read the Faerie Queene, that shows up only in the 1590 Faerie Queene of the early editions, and it's at the end. So a lot of modern editions, a lot of syllabi start people with Letter to Raleigh because it's basically Spencer, you know, saying this is how to read it. So, you know, one of the things that's curious about, and this isn't quite typographic, it's more kind of the structure of the book and the kind of quirk of where all that prefatory material ends up. But the experience, again, so different from a modern classroom, modern edition, the experience of making your way, fighting your way through the whole thing, if you make it to the end of book 3, and then reading that it's an allegory and who is who and all of that, I think is really weird.
That's also a weird bit of printing too, because it's so typical to get the preliminaries last, print them last, and put them in the
Exactly,
front.
that's the standard practice.
So what, you know, they've messed up there too.
Yeah, it's a colossal screw up. And then the dedicatory poem to Elizabeth is on the verso of the title page. So it looks like, and so people have speculated, like in the print shop, what were they going to do? They couldn't put that at the end. That would be rude. But it ends up in this very kind of haphazard last moment kind of play.
It's interesting to think about someone reading that in 1590 because they would never guess that it's Welsh.
That's right.
You know, and I think, I mean, Peter has seen more of it, but I think the first thing you would think is that something has been censored. You know, that something has had to be left out there.
And
You would not think, oh,
right.
it's Welsh, so they, you know,
right.
But that they're leaving something important out.
Yeah.
You know, that couldn't be said.
Yeah, that's a great guess.
What does the Welsh say?
The Welsh says like it's a red shield or a green shield. So one of them is, I've forgotten which is which, but one is like red shield, the other is green shield.
You know how many copies were printed in 1590? Any guesses? Usual, is it the usual? Maybe there's 500, maybe there's 750.
Yes, I think it's at 64. You know, in the Spencer Archive on Spencer Online identifies 64. It's a lot. Because it, yeah.
Thank you. A question that's maybe too obvious about Spencer. We talked about the difficulty of the poem conceptually, the difficulty of the ways in which allegory work, but of course also it's linguistically very peculiar. You know, there's I've used writing this peculiar archaic English that isn't 16th century English. It would seem that there would be many opportunities for printers to be confused by the language. So are there other places in the 1590 where you could say the printers are just throwing up their hands? And like dull collation question, does stuff get corrected in 1596 in the first 3 books? So Are there textual differences, and there do you have the sense that it's Spencer who is intervening?
Yeah, not a too easy question at all. So again, and it's this, I think, quite frustrating bit of modern editions that almost none of this is easily visible in modern editions. Again, which, like Douglas Brooks writing about printing, quotes Roche, like people who really know what to look at just do the modern edition. Something like, I know that so 1596 is often taken as the copy text. And I know from collations that other people have done that from the 1596 to the one we have in the room, the 1609 works, that something on the order of 1,000 corrections are made. And a lot of corrections are also made between 1590 and 1596. I don't know the number offhand, but a lot of corrections are made. And there's an errata sheet that is with the 1590 that some people go and correct. It doesn't include these examples we've been talking about.
Are they corrections that render it into more standard 16th century?
Not, I mean,
or are they corrections that retain Spencer's?
They retain Spencer's archaisms, and it's interesting to hear your perspective, because my sense is that, yes, in terms of some of the vocabulary, Spencer is absolutely making it kind of ye olden times, but in terms of the spelling itself, to me, it doesn't seem that different from a Shakespeare quarto. I'd be curious what other people think. Like if I'm just reading Shakespeare quartos and the Faerie Queene in the 1590, except for the vocabulary oddities, it doesn't read wildly different to me. I think what happens is we're so used to reading cleaned up, modernized plays, and editors don't do that because it's making it archaic.
I was trying to remember who it was who said, for a lesson period or slightly later, Spencer writ no tongue. And that's in period, right? And who is that attributed to?
I should know that. I don't.
I wonder if I could just sort of butt in here, but just because, I mean, I know that Kathy Nicholson has written about this question, and I think we need to kind of keep separate in our minds the question of the spelling and the language. I mean, Spencer writ no tongue was definitely something that was said, but to the extent that that was attached to the orthography, I think is, that might be a more modern sort of understanding. But it is interesting, and this is what I think, and I don't want to, I mean, I think people should go and read Kathy's work on this, because I may be misrepresenting the argument here, but my understanding is that the interest in Spencer's spelling and the sort of way in which we honor the Spencer spelling as an archaic aspect to the text was something that only came later. And I mean, not much later, but a bit later. And I was thinking, I wonder whether that might at least be part of the story of why we haven't paid the same level of attention to the material text of Spencer as we have in other early modern texts, that there's some sense that somehow, because we've been we've been so good about preserving the spelling, which itself may be an anachronistic idea of how Spencer's archaism is working, but that because we've sort of been so good about honoring that, we don't need to pay as much attention to the material text or something, which betrays in a way a very kind of idealizing notion of what the material text actually is, that is less sensitive to things like the sorts of things you're looking at. But yeah, just some sort of thoughts about that.
Yeah, great thoughts, and I'm so glad you mentioned her book Reading and Not Reading, The Faerie Queene. Great book. And it's in a longer version. It's in the chapter, sort of talking about using sort of her insights. It's a wonderful book. And I think that's an excellent guess or proposal about why we haven't been more attentive to the material text. Again, this notion we're throwing U's instead of V's at readers. We're keeping the IE. We're keeping the Y as a prefix for past tense. So we don't need to also, with this very difficult poem, this unreadable poem, we don't also need to sort of capture the kind of details that I've been talking about.
You get more book history work done with Shepherd's Calendar, right? But
Yeah,
there
right,
you have
right.
text and image, you know,
Exactly.
so it's calling for that kind of.
Right.
I do think that the prefix, the Y prefix is a different case, right? It's not really spelling.
Right.
But it would be extremely hard to get the compositors. I mean, that would work against their habit hugely to follow spelling of the copy. So if you really wanted to spell things in a particular way, you'd have to have like a whole extra apparatus to tell the print shop to
Right.
follow the
Follow it
spelling.
exactly.
Exactly. I don't think that was happening.
And I mean, I think that's also what I think is unlikely, that Spencer is there sort of supervising, saying, keep that IE, keep the.
Go ahead, Mark.
But there's a lovely echo, if I think if my notes from your slides are correct, that when we meet Abessa, she could not hear spelled the same way as hear, prepare
Yes.
later,
Yes,
right? So
exactly.
there we get like a really evocative echo in the spelling,
Exactly.
whether that's a compositor, like sort of conspiring with this reading that you're working through, or if it's actually intentional in some way. And I thought that she could not hear nor speak nor understand after identifying her as a rude wench, such a powerful moment, particularly with understanding being related to salvation, which came up in a Q&A a bit. And I was also thinking you kind of dove into rude a little bit, but I've been thinking a lot with Carissa Harris about some of her recent work on wench as a class and race identity that becomes increasingly racialized in the 17th century. She has a piece that's about to come out and study Chaucer about this. But I think wench, like rude and wench, are two sides of the same disadvantaged position that Abessa feels herself in because of this lack of ability to hear, speak, and understand this sort of trifecta. So I think I'm really interested in that reading. I think it's really great, and I love how that spelling echo allows you to link those two moments.
Right. Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the tip about Carissa Harris. One along the lines of sort of the rudeness and possible ways in which it's racialized. You might one of the things that we're told about Abessa is that she's never seen anyone who looks as fair as Una before, and all the great work that's been done on fair, and there's been recent really good scholarship on Una's golden hair. So the sort of very racialized language that seems to be part of what kind of throws Abessa. So yeah, that's great. Thank you. Lila?
Jessica posits that letting wasn't consistently before the 18th century, but says someone who knows better should firefly.
Yeah, I don't think Peter was talking about letting in that sense of a rule. It's not what he's talking about. He's talking about like just putting in space.
Little pieces,
slots.
yes. Thank you for clarifying. On behalf of Jessica.
Yeah, Jerry.
Jerry?
Just a very quick follow-up to Marissa. The stanza before, she is a damsel, which is lie.
Yeah.
Right? And it's at the point at which you cannot speak, see, or hear
Right.
that she is demoted to rude wench.
Right, exactly.
Oh,
Exactly. Yeah.
That piece of type
That
also
piece
the falls, and then it's.
I know.
It
I
actually
know.
reminds me of Milton's line about all higher knowledge in her power falls degraded.
Oh, yes.
Where he's playing
Yes.
with the enjambment
Yes,
around the
that's
fall.
right.
That's weirdly accidental.
That is weird, yes.
But the question, who is it who is misperceiving her as a damsel in the stanza before?
Una.
Una. So Una, I don't know where this leads. I mean, Una is misreading her.
Yeah, I mean, and Una, and it's interesting. So like Queene, who's this sort of very anti-Catholic caricature, he sleeps with Abessa, he visits her at night, he spends a lot of time with her, but doesn't seem to register that she's deaf. But Una too. So it's like Una and Queene in this way are aligned, and that Una.
It only takes Una one stanza.
True. Not many, right? Not after many nights of carnal knowledge, right?
I was really interested about hearing your comments on rhizome, rhizomatic.
Yeah.
Like the representation.
Mhm.
Because I'm studying postmodernism and like there are really example of something like rhizome. So I was really interested about
Yeah.
that connection. I wanted to hear your opinions about maybe comment more on how the non-human aspect comes into play. Like, is that sort of like a compensation for the local hearing? So, because you said like the trees talk, it's not just
Right.
about like the traditional sense of metamorphosis when we talk about animals, for example, it's like you're talking about ecology and environment and stuff. So can you find out that a little bit more?
Yeah, no, that's great. It's like a lovely return to the first question. So in terms of kind of the notion of the non-human again and how it functions, I mean, I guess I'd start with just like a tiny way in that word bray. That again, one of the oddities, one of the fluidities of the poem is Una, who is meant to be the one true church, the Protestant church. She brays, and it's a word that is so coded non-human elsewhere in the poem. So I think it's, one reason people should read the Faerie Queene is it so speaks to very contemporary questions about post-human, non-human, interspecies, speciesism, all those hierarchies, because it's a poem that so insistently values hierarchy, like over and over again. And yet it also collapses them at many, many turns with something. That's why I like that, the sort of rhizomatic idea, as something non-human, with the idea that like the deafness and the muteness then kind of get detached. Like a Besset can't function any longer in the narrative, but that quality, that sort of non-human quality, then kind of floats around and gets attached to other characters. The other thing, just in case it's suggestive, and because he was a friend of both Zach's and mine, the late Douglas Brooks, in writing about it, one of the things he says, I think was so smart about the poem, is that in some ways it's a poem about the mouth. It's kind of the epic of the mouth. So for those of you who know it, Error is in Canto 1, and Air is this like monstrous hybrid female creature who spews ink and books and sort of vomits things like that all over the forest floor, that mouth. And then the poem closes with the blatant beast with all these tongues. And so that kind of notion that the poem itself is this kind of body. And there are moments in book 2 where there's a house that people go to that's clearly a body, but on this much bigger scale, that it's kind of this body with these big mouths at either end, neither of which are human mouths. And I think that's also interesting with the idea of muteness and what can be, what sounds come out of human bodies, whether they're non-normative or not.
Well, I think we should fall silent after a long evening. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.